All right, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to kind of look at the British colonies in America, but specifically the essential question that we're looking at. Oh, I didn't realize it, but the transition there. What are the differences between the Chesapeake, so kind of those central southern colonies, New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies? Okay, a lot of the time that we divide these colonies up into three regions, but for the sake of our explanation, we are going to we're going to divide it into four regions. You're going to have New England. So that's up at the top. So that's New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. So think like Boston. That's going to be your group up there. And then the next piece is the middle colonies. So this is areas that were controlled by the Dutch. So New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. And then you have the Chesapeake. So the Chesapeake really is Virginia. So the colony of Virginia, Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland. Okay, those are all going to be kind of included. Each of these regions is developed for a specific reason and therefore has a unique culture. And then lastly, you have the lower southern colonies. Okay, and each of them are going to have their own identity. We today are going to focus on the New England and the Chesapeake colonies. All right, so just a quick review. We're going to talk about Jamestown for a little bit. So, what does this advertisement reveal about the Jamestown colony? So, Nova Britannia offering most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia, exciting all such as will be well affected to further their fame. Okay, so what does this tell you about Jamestown? What are they trying to do? Who are they trying to attract? So, they're trying to attract people who are wanting to make money off of planting. And also, if you're wanting to become famous, then you should come to Jamestown. And so those are the types of people that they're going to attract. Those transitions. Okay. So unlike the Spanish, the French and the British colonies are not going to be strictly funded or controlled by the king. Though they do have those types of colonies, for the most part, you're going to have different types of colonies developed for different reasons. So this particular colony is a joint stock company. So it's formed by entrepreneurs in Britain who hoped to profit by establishing a colony. So it was made for profit. And once the charter was gained from the king, so he gave a grant, they could go in and move in. Okay, so in 1606, Virginia Company is going to be formed and investors are going to find gold, hoping to find gold in the New World, but we know that that is not the case. They're going to found Jamestown. It's going to become the first permanent colony, and it's going to be in present-day Virginia. Okay, so looking at the picture of the colony. Okay, we've talked about some of their advantages or disadvantages, but advantages, if we're looking at this from a money-making perspective, it's got nice deep ports. It's got a little bit of a barrier between them and the inland with that river in the background. There's also some swampland in between. But disadvantages is that it's on a swamp and it's on an island and it's very isolated. Settlers are also going to build a fort, but they're going to struggle for their first years in America to survive. And we know that's because they didn't send anybody who could grow food. They just sent gentry and gold makers. And so they're really going to struggle. And so you're going to see that there's going to be some clashes. Let me back up. So I don't really care. I don't know why I put this in here, but walls, triangular shaped fort, rounded bunk walls. It's easier to send a cannon off of. They angle the walls in so that it's harder for them to climb. So settlers arrived looking for gold and did not prepare to stay. And like we've talked about, they starved. Again, this is just review to tie the two things together. John Smith took control and forced the settlers to farm. So remember, he who will not eat will not work. If you're not going to eat, if you're not going to work, you're going to die. We're not going to feed you. And he held to that. People died of starvation who refused to eat. Like we've talked about, it was in a swamp. So it's located in a swamp and it lots of outbreaks of disease associated with mosquitoes in particular. So things like malaria, where you essentially puke and poop yourself to death. It's a really terrible disease. You die of dehydration, which is just absolutely awful. You can tell this is an old PowerPoint. I put some really aggressive transitions in here. So Jamestown is going to be located with the Powhatan Indians and they're going to attack the settlement. But over time, they're going to develop kind of a relatively cordial trading relationship. Okay, so what does this reveal about Jamestown? What does this image reveal about Jamestown? I want you to think about that for a second. Take some observations. I'll minimize myself for a second so you can look at the whole thing. All right, so what we're seeing some, I don't know how to put my face back up there, but it's okay. So I see tobacco plants and barrels. Looks like what potentially are African slaves working this land. And then you have some traders here. So it looks like we're definitely tobacco based, which is true. So after they failed to find gold, they needed to find other ways to make money because just like today, companies need to keep their investors happy. Otherwise, they're going to demand their money back. And so they're going to introduce tobacco, and it is going to be wildly popular across the world. They're going to introduce a particularly smooth variation that becomes very attractive to Europeans. And so we're shipping that tobacco out of Jamestown onto a ship and into Europe. So by far, tobacco is going to become the most profitable thing that colonists are going to plant. They are going to grow food and fruit, and rice is also going to be something that they get involved with. But large plantations are going to expand to try to find new land for farming. Because the thing about these types of crops is they are really, really hard on the land. They require enormous amounts of nutrients. And so if you continue to farm the land over and over, it's not going to grow. And so due to success of tobacco, it's going to expand. So it's going to expand out into Richmond and Williamsburg and Yorktown, and St. Mary's and Annapolis. And you're going to end up with multiple cities. And as they continue to expand, there's going to be a need for field laborers to plant and pick tobacco. Okay. And so to meet the demand, the first place that they're going to look is to use an indentured servant. Okay, indentured servants were typically poor men or women who agreed to work for land or a landowner in exchange for their travel to America. Sometimes, and in fact, in many cases, indentured servants would extend their years of service in exchange for land when they were done. Sometimes land and like a little bit of cash so that they had something to start with. So this, again, we've talked about the importance of land ownership and kind of that being a central theme in how we value people in the United States. Comes all the way back from this history that land ownership gives you the ability to move up and move forward. So indentured servants were similar to slaves in that they were not paid for their labor in the same way, but there also was an end of the service. So they were paid, but they served longer than what it cost. If that makes sense. Okay, so 1618 Virginia is going to introduce the head right system, which is going to give 50 acres. Here we go. Here it is. 50 acres to anyone who brought an indentured servant to the Americas. So the head right system is going to be a huge part of why this population grows. So some of them are going to go to the West Indies. You're going to see a lot of people go to the West Indies, which, what's our best guess about what we know about the West Indies? What we know about anybody who's going to the Caribbean to do labor is that they're likely not going to survive. And that was the case even in the Chesapeake. In fact, especially in the Chesapeake, this is part of why you see these huge numbers, is that a lot of these people are going to die before they actually get their land. But a lot of them will as well. And you're going to see 25,000 go to New England as well. So a large population of poor people in Britain is going to lead to people just starving to get over there and hopefully improve their life for their kids or themselves. And so indentured servants worked hard, they were treated badly, and many of them were often worked to death intentionally before their contracts came due. All right, so in addition to indentured servants, Virginia landowners are also going to use African slaves. But first, we've talked about this before, first time it's going to happen in 1619, where African slaves were brought to the United States actively in order to work on the tobacco plantations. So in the mid-1600s, fewer indentured servants came to America as the British economy improved. In the 1500s, 1600s, there are civil wars, people are dying, and so it's really hard to stay working when there's always wars being fought. But as more and more people went to the Americas and those peaceful times, started to return, you had fewer people who were willing, especially since a lot of them were dying. And so as a result, African slavery is eventually going to replace indentured servitude as the dominant system in Virginia. Okay, and so the way that the trade systems work, we're going to call it the triangle trade usually. The Europeans would come down to Africa, they'd take the slaves over to the New World, and then they'd return back to Europe with their goods from the Americas. Then they'd do it again. They'd go to Africa, they'd go to the New World, they'd drop off the slaves, they'd pick up goods, and they'd go to Europe. African slaves were transported on slave ships called the Middle Passage. And there's a lot of different reasons why it's called that, but a lot of it has to do with the way that a ship was packed. Okay. So most ship owners were tight packers. That means that they would cram as many slaves on the boat as humanly possible, knowing that some would die, in hopes that more would make it to the Americas. There were also loose packers or light packers who would buy fewer slaves and give them more space and hope they would survive. But tight packing was much more common. So I want you to kind of look at all of these are bodies. Okay, so this is what the layout of a slave ship would look like. Somebody had been ripped from their country, brought down into a ship, chained to the ship. They could not move. They were laying in their own feces. They rarely got anything to eat, or some of them were starving themselves because they didn't want to live. And so you have dead bodies and feces all around you, and you are in this boat for at least a month, if not 3 months, depending on your location. So most of the time, if you were a tight packer, the coffin position was one of the ways that they put people on the ships. Again, it is important to remember that these are people, okay? But over time, these slave traders, they had to convince themselves that these were not people, that these were cattle, that you could pack them into crates like chickens. And so this next image is probably a pretty generous one as far as how they were packed. They were laid essentially in bunk styles, in rows, flat on their backs, no air, no light, nothing. They were not allowed to move. They were chained where they were and laying in their feces. I really need to take those transitions out. African American captives were being thrown over. So this is an image of African American captives being thrown overboard. So if you misbehaved, you'd be thrown overboard. If you tried to start a mutiny, you were thrown overboard. If you did anything that slighted anyone, you were thrown overboard. Some people actually jumped overboard to commit suicide, but something that would happen that was incredibly common is sometimes the voyage would take a little longer than they planned and they would run out of food. So as a way to move faster and to have to feed less people, they would randomly select a few hundred of the people trapped below the ship and throw them overboard in the middle of the sea. In fact, sharks would actually follow the slave ships to consume the bodies. So once they arrived to America, they were put up for auction usually and sold to the highest bidder. Usually people were looking for people coming from West Africa with strong builds because of some genetic immunity to things like malaria, but also a series of other illnesses. A majority of people who come from Africa are taken and stripped away from their homeland, are brought to places in the Caribbean like Haiti, And sugar plantations are going to be kind of the norm in the Caribbean because of the climate. It also is, sugar was worth the same as gold by weight in this time period. And so people could actually grow it. And so they essentially, slaves were so easy to come by and so likely to die in these scenarios that they would just work them to death. And we unfortunately will have to talk about slavery a lot more in our time together. Okay, so hierarchy in the Chesapeake. So at the top, you have the tobacco, kind of the tobacco tycoons. Okay. Then you have poor small scale farmers, and they were of the largest class. Okay, so most of the people in the South or in the Chesapeake were low scale farmers. These are people who likely were indentured servants or worked on a ship at some point, and had a small plot of land that was able to just sustain themselves. They weren't making money. Because the reality is they were competing with slave labor. The people at the top had enormous numbers of slaves who were working for free. And how do you compete with that? How can you create value from what you produce when the people you're competing with do it for free? There were a few women in Virginia, but it made it difficult for colonists to marry or have families. Most of the women who are going to come to the Americas are going to be indentured servants, or come to the Chesapeake are going to be indentured servants. Because again, this was a business operation. It was not common for you to send women. And then down here at the bottom, you have indentured servants who are often mistreated, treated as non-human, non-citizen. But at the very bottom, you have African Americans or African slaves who were not treated as human, who were seen as property, and the laws would reflect that. Okay, so I want you to just take a second. I want you to observe this photo, and I want you to look at some of the details and what do you think is happening here? All right, so they appear to be relatively wealthy men. Somebody is talking to them like as a group. They're gathered around a table, and apparently they're kind of as a community. But if I read here at the bottom, it says meeting of the Assembly in the Settlement of Virginia. Okay, so we're together for some kind of political meeting. Okay, so Virginia colonists needed laws to maintain order, but the British government was thousands of miles away and had made it very clear that they were not interested in spending any money to govern these areas. So it was the responsibility of the colonists to come up with some way to govern it. So the same year that they had the first slaves come, they established the House of Burgesses. And this is the very first legislative assembly in America, so representatives coming in to speak and establish laws. So Virginia was also, over time, they kind of struggled to make money, so they were taken over as a royal colony. So it had the governor chosen. The governor was chosen by the king, so the House of Burgesses made important decisions regarding the laws and was overseen by the governor. But it's important to note that the leader, even though they were elected, they were a bunch of rich planters who did not represent the poor white farmers of the colony. So even early, when we're talking about Southern history, there's this very elitist system that exists. So former indentured servants in Western Virginia suffered from low tobacco prices because, again, how could they compete with someone who their labor is free? You'll talk about economics when you get to your senior year, but there's this sweet spot between supply and demand. The amount somebody wants, the amount that you produce versus the amount that you have. When you're competing with people who can produce mass amounts and sell it for really cheap, you're going to find that you're not going to make much money. Also, Virginian settlers are going to have to deal with Native American attacks because the further that they spread out, the deeper they get into Native American territory. So poor farmers led by Nathaniel Bacon are going to blame Virginia's governor for not protecting them and starting a rebellion. Okay, so here's the important point. These were both freed Africans and former indentured servants who united together to rebel against the Virginia Assembly. And this was a very successful, destructive rebellion. But it wasn't successful in what its true mission was. It proved that to Virginians that slaves were better than indentured servants. Bacon proved to rich Virginians that slaves and indentured servants needed to be separated, and that to make poor Virginians feel special, that the only people who should be doing this type of labor, who should be in a slavery type situation, will be people who are easy to identify as slaves, like the Africans. And so it separated those two groups. Those two groups had a lot in common. The poor former indentured servants and the poor former slaves or current slaves had a lot more in common with each other than the poor people with the rich planters. But the rich planters were savvy and knew that, okay, we need to make sure that these poor white people identify with us, even though we have nothing in common, rather than with our labor force. And so that really is the starting point, the spark for the major racial issues and the major superiority complex that is given to white Americans in the United States in this time period. Okay, we're going to skip this. All right, so still looking at that indentured question, we're going to transition from the Virginia colony now to the New England colonies. So the New England colonies are going to be up at the top, and these are going to be established primarily by religious dissidents. So in what ways was colonial New England different from Virginia? So looking at this picture, what things do you notice? So take a second, check it out. All right, so what I'm seeing so far, if I look through it, is I see, very first thing I see is a priest or some type of religious figure praying. It appears to be a family unit kind of around a table. You've got children, you've got women. You even have Native Americans if you look deeper into the picture. It looks like a much more isolated area. But really, I think the big theme that I'm seeing here is family and religion. Okay, so the colonists who first fled to New England came for religious reasons. So they didn't come because they wanted to make money. They came because they were being persecuted in their home countries. Okay, so let's break this down. So the early Christian church was united before the Great Schism. So the East-West Schism, which means a break. Okay, so the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church are going to split, and you still will see that today. You have a split in the church between the Eastern and the Roman. It was a disagreement over specifically how communion should be practiced, and so they split their separate ways. But in the Reformation, you have this big branch off into Protestantism, and eventually, first off, it started as Lutheranism and Calvinism, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But Anglicanism is going to be the Church of England that King Henry VIII, who wanted a divorce and had all the wives, created in order to give himself that opportunity. And so within England, they started to have all of these different branch-offs. And so religious disagreements in Britain led to divisions in the Anglican Church, and you started to have these separatist movements develop. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. It's been such a long time since I've used this one. So Puritans believed that the Anglican Church compromised way too much by allowing Catholic rituals. So they wanted to get rid of as much of the Catholic Church as humanly possible. So Puritans believed that your worship of God should be very simple. That you shouldn't have flashy ceremonies and statues and incense, that it should be just you and God and very internal, you and God in the Bible and prayer. But they also believed in the Calvinist idea of predestination, that some people are pre-chosen for heaven while others are not. That a certain elite group is going to make it, while the other ones, God has already decided you're not going to make it. But for the sake of his mercy, you should, still do good things. At predestination, and tried to live strictly Christian lives without sin. So they were very conservative. They did everything that they could to separate themselves from sinful ideas so that they could live totally pure lives. Okay, some radical Puritans were known as, what I've already mentioned, separatists, which means they wanted to live separately from the rest of the world. And they were unwilling to wait for the church to go through the reforms required. And England was a really small country, so they couldn't just go out and have their own spot. So this would be the closest example that we have today would be really conservative Mennonite groups or different branches of the Amish or the Quaker that are still separatists today. Okay, so separatists became known as pilgrims. Okay, so pilgrims, it just means that they travel from one place to another. They're going to form a joint stock company. And they're going to gain a charter, and they're going to land in Plymouth. That was not their plan. They were trying to go to Virginia, but they landed in Plymouth, and they stayed there. But before landing in America, the Pilgrims created the Mayflower Compact, which was essentially a form of constitution where they agreed to work together as a civil body politic. So the Mayflower Compact was one of the first examples of self-government in the United States, that they had created this kind of community-based government. Okay. When the Pilgrims founded Plymouth in 1620, so all of this stuff is happening very close together. You've got all of the big slavery stuff, the House of Burges happening, the first African slaves happening in 1619. They land in Plymouth in 1620, but they're going to face disease and hunger. But the Pilgrims are going to receive help from local natives like the Squanto or the Massaquoi. And celebrated Thanksgiving in honor of local Indians. Now, this was only one group at one time. For the most part, and we're going to talk specifically more about other groups, like when we get to the Salem witch trials, that did not have good relationships with the Native Americans. Sorry, I need to take these transitions out. Okay, so when separatist pilgrims came to America, the Puritans remained with the Church of England. Okay, but when the Catholic King Charles I came to power, Puritans felt like it was their time to leave Britain. Okay, so there's two groups. You have the separatist Puritans, so you have the separatist pilgrims, and then you have the Puritans. Okay, so the Puritans are going to remain within the Church of England, but they felt it was time to leave Great Britain. So in 1630, Puritans are going to arrive in Boston. Okay, so Plymouth is out here, and then you have Boston up here. So they are separated, they are similar, but they are functioning in different ways. So the Plymouth colony is the one that had a relatively friendly relationship. Our establishment up here in Massachusetts, Boston, Salem area, is not going to go quite the same. Okay, so from 1630 to 1640, leader John Winthrop, okay, he's a big deal, is going to lead 16,000 Puritans to the Massachusetts Bay Colony as part of the Great Migration. So at this time, 13,000 people was an enormous number of people. This was a large community. And so you have a migration of all of these people out of England to try to get religious freedom because they were being persecuted in their home country. Okay, so John Winthrop, kind of thinking on the same line, he's a Calvinist, kind of thinking about Calvinism and then thinking about John Winthrop. He wanted to build Boston as a city on a hill, to be a model for other Christians, that essentially the nation that we create is going to be a beacon of hope for all mankind. So again, kind of this elite, we are special kind of thinking. So, what makes New England society unique? So, New England, again, is all the way up, and it's going to be completely different from some of the other places. So, Massachusetts was a very different colony from Virginia. It is going to be focused on religious freedom. So, it's not going to be based in making profit, and it's not going to be based in single men. It's going to be based primarily in families. And bringing their families, their maid servants, and they want to start and build lasting communities here. All my alarms going up. So settlers are going to sacrifice for the common good. They're going to build schools. They're going to focus on subsistence farming. This is huge. Subsistence farming. It means that they're not farming for profit. They may sell things here or there, but subsistence means I am growing enough to survive. Okay. And New England was more a healthy place to live than Virginian colonists, so they lived longer. The weather was less crazy up in that area. They did still have very cold winters, but they didn't have like hurricanes. They had a much more familiar climate to what they had had in England in this part of the country. So looking at this break off here. So in England, a male was expected to maybe live to 55. In the Chesapeake Bay area, maybe 49 if they were lucky. But in New England, it's nearly 65. Okay, so social hierarchy in New England is much simpler. At the top, you have the religious leaders. So they are going to serve as the government leaders, and they're going to be the top of New England society. So what the religious leader says goes. Then a majority of people in the New England population are going to be small-scale farmers who are loyal to the local community. Okay, so they are very committed to each other. And then at the bottom was a small population of poor, landless laborers and servants. So these are the people who they brought with them, or indentured servants, which we do have some of in the north. And eventually we will have some slaves there as well. Okay, so what functions could this building have in New England? What would the potential purposes of this building be in New England? So looking at it, we see some pew benches. We see like a stand. So it's likely a church. And more likely than not, if the whole community is kind of on the same page church-wise, you're probably going to use this for political conversations as well. Maybe also like your court. So the government in New England colonies were centered around the church through town meetings. So the town like meeting house would be in the center of town, and that would be at church. So the church would be the center of the community, and the community would be built around it. Each New England town was independently governed by local church leaders, so there was no like overseeing person. So each of them made their own choices. All adult church members were allowed to vote for local laws and taxes. So again, kind of that bringing in that heritage of the Magna Carta Constitution style democratically influenced system where they had representative government in England. They're bringing that over to their local communities. Okay, as the Massachusetts colony grew, it spawned 4 new colonies. Okay, so you've got New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Haven, and Connecticut. So Connecticut was important in creating the first written constitution. It's called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So the way that they ran their government is going to heavily influence the Constitution. Okay, so New England Puritans did not like the ideas that differed from their own, particularly pagan, Native American beliefs, where they worshipped nature. And so Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts for demanding that Indians be paid for their land, and he formed Rhode Island. So some people were like, no, you should pay the Native Americans for stealing their land, and he was banished. So he made his own colony. So these are some of the dissidents. Okay, so they didn't treat people who disagreed with them all that well. And Hutchinson was banished for challenging Puritan authority. So what authority do you have to be doing this? Prove to me how you accomplish this. Okay, so what's going on in this image? King Philip's War. Okay, so Metacom fails in mission to make Mohawk allies. Travels to Metcom, major Indian attack on English, major English attack on Indians, English offensive, Mohawk offensive, Indian captive, sold in slavery in the West Indies. Oh, important Indian settlements, important English settlements, and present state boundaries. Okay, so this is all conflict with Native Americans. The Puritans were not friendly with the Native Americans for that same reason that they didn't treat dissidents all that well. So as New England colonies expanded into new lands, they started to push the Native Americans further and further. And sometimes somebody, you're sitting at your desk, you have to share a desk with somebody, and somebody puts their elbow on your desk a little bit. Sometimes you just blow it off. So Native Americans are the white people kind of encroach a little bit. That's fine. They can live there as long as they stay there. But then, this person puts their binder on your desk and throws their arm out and completely crushes you. There's going to be conflict over what space is yours. So conflicts are going to arise between Native Americans as they push them out further and further. So the Pequot War in 1637 was the first major British-led attack on Indians and led to the death of 1,600 Native Americans. Okay, so this war is going to break out in 1675. The Wampanoag Indians are going to raid towns, killing 10% of all colonial New England men. So they're going to come at night, they're going to kill them in their beds, and that's going to have a lasting effect on the psyche of some of these colonies. All right, so what might have caused the hysteria in this image? First of all, what do we think it's representing, and what might have caused it? So we've got a girl screaming over here and throwing her arms up. We've got a girl fainted over here. We've got some very panicked, concerned leadermen up here. This girl looks like she's doing something crazy. All right, so by the 1600s, many New England towns are going to experience a drop-off in church membership. And so churches are going to respond with the halfway covenant, which gave full church membership to people who had not had a conversion experience. So people are going to start coming back to the church, and you're going to see kind of a declining importance of religion. But religion is going to play a huge role in the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692. So several young girls are going to accuse women that they did not like, older women in the community, of being witches. The hysteria was caused by tensions over land ownership, Indian attacks, and religious disagreements, and just general kind of superstition. There was... So, you have to think about it this way. Not only are these women raised to believe that there's a very specific set of, you should be afraid of witches, that witches actively exist, and that they work for the devil and are trying to take you. Then you have these encounters with Native Americans who appear to be crazed because you don't speak their language, and they do these crazy dances around the fires, and then on top of that, they come and they try to kill you in your sleep. And so historians argue that these women actually had PTSD and were having episodes at this time and accusing women of witches, and that they actually believed that these things were true. Some stories kind of paint it like they were faking the stories, but I think in many cases historians believe that the women did believe, in fact, that they were having these experiences, and that they blamed it on these women, but these women were likely innocent. I apologize for these. I'm sorry. So as a result of these trials, people were jailed and killed, and 19 people were killed and 150 citizens were jailed. Okay, so they would do crazy tests in this image, this person on the floor has been accused of being a witch. Okay? And so their test for whether or not you are a witch is, if you get crushed by the stones, then you are a person. But if you live, then you're a witch. Which is kind of a no-win scenario for you. Or another test for whether or not someone was a witch was, they'd put you underwater. And if you floated, you were a witch. And if you sunk, that means you were not a witch. Or if you had like a weird mole, it was the mark of the devil. Like their ways of coming to these conclusions were very poorly thought out. Okay, so we're going to skip this closure activity and we're going to kind of leave it off here. So, kind of reviewing the two, actually, let me feel like there's something else. Okay, so what I want you to think about, we're going to do a graphic organizer probably on Tuesday, but I want you to be thinking about identifying these differences. So, what was the political system in the Chesapeake? What was their economic system? What were kind of their social uh, elements to their society? What did it look like? And the same thing through New England. What type of political systems did they have? How did they use their money? What was their focus on that? And then what does their society look like? So I want you to be thinking about that. You don't have to create this yet unless you do want to put it on your notes, but I just want you to kind of brainstorm on that and be prepared for class next time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. This is due on Tuesday by the beginning of class. You will have a reading quiz for it. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will talk to you soon.